Ever feel like you're always on this journey of figuring things out? Like who you are, what you want to do, how the world works?
Yeah, figuring things out, that's basically life, right?
Totally. And it never really stops.
Exactly. We're always evolving. And that's actually what we're diving into today.
That's right. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the fascinating science behind how we grow and change throughout our lives.
It's called the lifespan perspective on development. And we're going to look at how and why we transform from those early years all the way to old age.
All backed by solid academic research, of course. Think of this as your crash course on the human experience. We'll uncover some pretty surprising facts about aging, break down key concepts, and even look at how researchers study all of this.
And our mission.
To give you a rock-solid understanding of how we develop across our entire lifespan, by the end of this, you'll see what makes you you, and how your experiences, past and present, might shape your future.
It's a lot to unpack.
Definitely. Okay, let's start with a big question. Why is it even important to study how we develop across our whole lives? It might seem kind of obvious, but let's dig a little deeper.
Well, I think when you really think about it, understanding how people develop at different ages is super helpful in tons of different areas. Like think about parents, teachers, coaches. If you're working with people, knowing what to expect at different stages can really make a huge difference in how you approach things.
Yeah. And even on a personal level, just thinking about lifespan development can give you some serious aha moments. You might start to connect those dots between stuff you experienced growing up and how you see the world or react to things now.
Exactly. It's self-reflection, but on a deeper level. It helps you understand your own journey, where you've been, where you might be going. Plus, studying the human lifespan, it just brings up so many interesting questions about what it means to grow and change over decades.
And it's way more than just getting taller or learning more facts in school. It's a whole process.
Totally. And our sources really emphasize this. Development includes all that amazing growth we see early on, but it also includes the natural parts of decline that come later in life. It's the full circle.
It's the circle of life.
Exactly. And as you listen, I'd encourage you to kind of take a step back and think about your own life so far. Like, how have your experiences, big and small, shaped who you are today? And how might what you're going through right now influence your future?
So let's talk about how our understanding of development has evolved. How does the old school view compare to this lifespan perspective we keep mentioning?
Well, traditionally, the focus was super heavy on childhood and adolescence. People thought the most important changes happened then, adulthood. That was seen as this period of stability, kind of just coasting along, followed by decline in older age. Like the main story was over after high school.
So once you got your diploma, that was pretty much it in terms of big developmental changes.
Yeah, that was the general idea. But this lifespan perspective, it argues that important developmental changes actually continue throughout adulthood. And there's a huge reason for this shift in thinking.
Tell me more.
Life expectancy, it's way up. Think about it. In the 20th century alone, the average life expectancy in the U.S. increased by like 30 years.
Wow, 30 years.
Yeah. Thanks to things like better sanitation, better nutrition, and huge advances in medicine, we're living much longer.
30 years, that's like adding on a whole other adulthood that people weren't really expecting. It completely changes the game.
It does. The sources even point out that in the U.S., for the first time in history, in 2019, there were actually more people over 60 than under 18.
Wow, that's wild.
And that longer lifespan, well, as researcher Laura Carstensen puts it, it creates some really interesting challenges and also some really exciting opportunities.
What does Carstensen have to say about this bonus time we have?
She makes this really good point. She says our society is still very much built around this idea of a shorter lifespan. Everything's kind of geared towards the young. So the challenge now is to adapt our structures, like work structures, social expectations, even technology, to support this larger, older population.
And to value their experiences and knowledge, right?
Exactly. Like Carstensen argues that we often focus on what older people might lose as they age instead of appreciating and leveraging their unique strengths.
Right, like their emotional wisdom or resilience.
Yeah, exactly.
So the lifespan perspective is all about recognizing we're always evolving. And I know a researcher named Paul Baltz really laid out some core ideas about this whole perspective.
He did. Baltz is like a pioneer in this field, and he highlighted some key characteristics of lifespan development. First up, it's lifelong, which just means, yep, it happens across all stages of life.
Which aligns perfectly with that increased life expectancy we talked about. What's next?
Development is multidimensional. This basically means that at every age, we're changing in so many ways at once. Our bodies, minds, emotions, relationships are all intertwined, influencing each other.
So it's not just one thing changing at a time.
Nope. We're talking about physical changes, cognitive changes, social and emotional changes, all happening simultaneously.
Like if you think about it, your physical health can totally affect your mood, which in turn affects how you interact with people.
Exactly. It's a cascade. And within each of these areas, there are even more specific changes going on. Like in the cognitive realm, you have changes in your attention span, memory, problem-solving skills, even social intelligence, like how well you read a room.
Okay, so multidimensional.
Hmm.
What else?
Next up, multi-directional. This is an interesting one. It basically means that as we go through life, some of our abilities might be increasing while others are actually decreasing. It's not all about growth all the time.
So like a trade-off, kind of.
Yeah, kinda. Like, think about language learning. Young kids pick up languages super easily, but that might not be as true later in life, right? Or think about social groups. As you get older and maybe start a family or get really busy with work, you might spend less time hanging out with a big group of friends. But on the flip side, things like wisdom and the ability to make good decisions based on your experiences, those often increase as you age.
It's like a balancing act. You gain in some areas while you might lose little in others.
Yeah.
Okay, so multi-directional development. What's number 4?
Plasticity. This is a big one. It basically refers to our capacity for change throughout life. And even though it's more obvious when we're younger, research shows that even in older age, you can still improve things like your memory or thinking skills through training and new strategies.
So you're saying you can teach an old dog new tricks.
Exactly. We can adapt and change, though research does suggest that our capacity for big change might become more limited as we age.
Makes sense. Okay, what's the next key idea?
Fifth, development is multidisciplinary. This basically means that we need lots of different perspectives to really understand it. It's not just psychologists.
So we need more than just the psych books, right?
Definitely. Experts from fields like sociology, anthropology, neuroscience, even medicine, all contribute to the understanding of how we develop across our lifespan. They all bring different tools and ways of looking at things.
I can see how that would be important. Like a brain scientist might look at how our brains change as we age, while a sociologist is looking at how cultural expectations influence our roles at different ages.
Exactly. Lots of different pieces to the puzzle. Okay, sixth, development is contextual. We're not developing in some vacuum, right? Everything happens within a certain setting. Our families, schools, neighborhoods, cultures, even historical events, all of these shape who we are.
And those contexts are always changing too.
Absolutely, they're dynamic. And Baltz, he identified 3 main types of influences within those changing contexts. First, normative, age-graded influences. These are things that are pretty predictable for people in a certain age group, like hitting puberty or graduating from high school or retiring.
Makes sense.
Then there are normative history-graded influences. These are influences that are common to people of a particular generation because of the major events they lived through.
Okay, so like how millennials and Gen Z interact with technology because of the internet, or how the Great Depression affected people who lived through it, those shared experiences really shape an entire generation, right?
Exactly. And finally, there are non-normative life events. These are unique personal experiences, like a serious illness or winning the lottery or a sudden career change. Things that don't happen to everyone don't happen at predictable times.
Okay, so all these influences, they're all working together and shaping us. What was Bald's final point?
His 7th and final point is that development is a co-construction of biology, culture, and the individual. It's not just nature versus nurture. It's this beautiful interplay of all 3. Our genes influence our culture, but our culture also shapes how our genes express themselves.
Oh, I like that, a co-construction. It emphasizes that we have a role in this whole thing, right? We're not just passive passengers.
Exactly. We make choices that can actively influence our developmental paths. And it brings us to another important point.
What's that?
The lifespan perspective. It really opens up a lot of questions about the world around us. There are so many contemporary issues that researchers are looking at through this lens.
Yeah, and our sources touch on a ton of them. Things like how technology is changing the way we form relationships, whether genetics play a role in our political beliefs, and really big social issues like gender inequality and health disparities between different groups.
Absolutely. And you can't forget about health and well-being overall. That's a huge area of study. Researchers are looking at the impact of diet and exercise across the lifespan, how to understand addiction, how older adults cope with health issues, and so much more.
And what about parenting and education? Those are constantly being studied too, right?
All the time. Researchers want to know the best ways to raise children, the impacts of things like both parents working, how to improve our education system. There are always new questions.
It seems like there's so much to research in this field.
Oh, absolutely. And remember that social and cultural context we talked about, that plays a huge role too. Our sources talk specifically about socioeconomic status, or SES, basically where someone stands in society based on things like their job, education level, and income, and there can be huge inequalities tied to those differences.
Yeah, sadly, that's true. And gender is another really important part of that context too.
Absolutely. It shapes how we see ourselves and interact with the world. All of these things, they're connected to something called social policy. It's about the actions that governments take to improve the well-being of their citizens. And there's a lot of research going on that's aimed at helping to create effective social policies, especially for the most vulnerable, like children and older adults.
Our sources mention that child poverty rates in the U.S. are way too high compared to other developed countries, and kids growing up in poverty face more stressors than their peers.
Yeah, that's a huge issue. But researchers also look at resilience, like how some kids manage to thrive even when facing major challenges. And the research suggests that things like good problem-solving skills and positive parenting can really make a difference.
And speaking of vulnerable populations, when we think about older adults, issues like the cost of healthcare and access to healthcare are huge concerns.
Oh, absolutely. And there are programs out there that are trying to address these issues. One example our sources mention is the Minnesota Family Investment Program, or MFP. It's a program that helps low-income families, and it's been shown to have a positive impact on kids, leading to better outcomes in school and fewer behavioral problems.
It's interesting to see how these programs can actually make a difference. There's also Ascend, right? That one tries to help families living in poverty by focusing on education for both the kids and the parents.
Exactly. It's about empowering families to break the cycle of poverty. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the mechanics of development. Our sources break it down into processes, periods, and some key debates.
Okay, sounds good.
So first up, development is a complex process of change driven by three main types of processes: biological, cognitive, and socio-emotional.
Can you give us some examples of each of those?
Sure. Biological processes, those are the physical changes. Your genes, brain development, hitting growth spurts, puberty. Cognitive processes are about how you think, your intelligence, your language skills. And then socio-emotional processes, those involve your relationships, your emotions, your personality.
So like when a teenager goes through puberty, that's a biological change that can then affect their emotions, which then influences how they think about themselves and their relationships. It's all interconnected.
Precisely. And these processes, they don't happen in isolation. They often influence each other, and they all contribute to the different periods of development that we often use to understand the human lifespan.
And how many of these periods are there?
The sources outline 8 main periods: the prenatal period, from conception to birth; infancy, from birth to about 18 or 24 months; early childhood, from the end of infancy to around 5 or 6 years old; middle and late childhood, from about 6 to 11 years old; adolescence, roughly from 10 or 12 to 18 or 21 years old; and then this interesting period called emerging adulthood.
Emerging adulthood.
Yeah. It's a newer concept. It covers that time from about 18 to 25. It's a time when people are kind of exploring different possibilities for their lives, trying out careers, figuring out their identities and their lifestyles.
Sounds like my early 20s for sure.
Right. And then, of course, we have early adulthood, which is typically your 20s and 30s, middle adulthood, which is roughly from 40 to 60, and then late adulthood from your 60s or 70s until death.
And within late adulthood, they even make a distinction between the young old and the oldest old, right?
Yep. The young old are usually considered those from 65 to 84. They're often still pretty active and healthy. Then the oldest old are 85 and older, and they might experience more health challenges.
It's interesting how being old really isn't just one thing. And speaking of age, the sources make this point that there's more to it than just how many candles are on your birthday cake.
That's right. Chronological age is just the number, but then you've got biological age, which is a measure of your body's health. Someone might be chronologically older, but biologically younger if they've taken really good care of themselves. Then there's psychological age.
Psychological age, that's how old you feel.
Kind of. It's really about how well you can adapt to new situations, cope with stress, and think clearly compared to other people your age. And finally, there's social age, which is about your connections with people and the social roles you have in your life.
So like a 70-year-old who's still really active, learning new things, and has tons of friends, might have a younger biological, psychological, and social age than someone who's the same age but less active and more isolated.
That's the idea. And there's this researcher named K. Warner Shea who described 3 different patterns of aging. Normal aging, which is that typical gradual decline we see in later years. Pathological aging, which is when you see more rapid decline, often due to disease. And then there's successful aging.
What does that mean, successful aging?
It's about people maintaining that positive development for a longer period of time. There's lots of research going on trying to figure out how people can age successfully.
It's like aging gracefully.
Exactly. Now, we've talked about the processes and the periods, but let's not forget about some big ongoing debates in the field of developmental psychology.
Yeah, those core developmental issues, right?
That's right. There are 3 main ones. First up, you've got the nature-nurture issue. This is the classic question of how much our genes influence who we are versus how much our experiences matter.
The classic chicken or the egg question of development. Like, are we mostly a product of what we're born with, or are we shaped by how we're raised?
Exactly. And honestly, most experts agree that it's really an interaction of both. It's this beautiful dance between nature and nurture.
It makes sense that both are important.
And then there's the issue of stability and change. This one asks, do our early personality traits and characteristics stick with us throughout life? Or do we really change in significant ways as we get older?
Like, if you're a shy kid, are you destined to be shy forever? Or can you become more outgoing over time? I'd like to think we can change, but I guess it depends.
You're getting it. And this also ties into whether our early experiences or later experiences have a bigger impact. Some theories say those early experiences are crucial, that they leave a lasting mark. Others emphasize that because of plasticity, we can continue to change and grow throughout life.
Okay, so there's no simple answer. What's the third big debate?
It's the question of continuity and discontinuity.
Ah, yes, the big debate about how development actually happens. Does it happen smoothly, gradually, like a tree growing taller? Or does it happen in these distinct stages, with more sudden jumps, kind of like a caterpillar transforming into a butterfly?
Exactly. Think of Piaget's theory of cognitive development. That's an example of a discontinuous view, with those distinct stages. But then you have something like the information processing theory, which sees cognitive development as a more gradual improvement in our abilities. That's more of a continuous view.
So both processes are at play.
Right. It's rarely ever just one or the other. Okay, now that we've laid the groundwork, let's talk about how researchers actually study all this incredibly complex stuff.
Because how do you even begin to untangle all these different influences?
Well, that's where theories come in. They're like the roadmaps. They help us to make sense of things.
Okay, and how do theories help researchers?
They provide frameworks for understanding development, guiding our thinking, and helping us to generate testable hypotheses, which we can then investigate using the scientific method.
So a theory is more than just a guess. It's more like a structured explanation.
Yeah.
A starting point, right?
Right. The scientific method, as our sources remind us, involves identifying a research question, gathering information, carefully analyzing that information, and then drawing conclusions.
So, like a detective, basically.
Yeah.
Our sources outline 5 main approaches to understanding development. Let's take them one by one. Let's start with psychoanalytic theories, with Freud and Erikson being the heavy hitters.
Right. Psychoanalytic theories, they really emphasize the power of our unconscious thoughts and emotions. Freud, he's famous for his psychosexual theory. He proposed these 5 stages of development: oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital, and he argued that our adult personality is heavily influenced by how we deal with certain conflicts at each of these stages. He also talked about this concept of fixation.
Fixation.
Yeah, the idea that if your needs aren't met properly at a particular stage, it can actually affect you later in life.
Interesting. And what about Erikson? Didn't he expand on Freud's work?
He did. Erikson took some of those basic Freudian ideas, but he was more focused on social interactions and how development continues across the entire lifespan. His psychosocial theory, it describes 8 stages of development, from infancy to old age, and each stage is marked by a certain psychosocial crisis or challenge that needs to be resolved.
Okay, so like for teenagers, is it that whole identity versus role confusion thing?
Exactly. That's a classic Ericksonian crisis. He really moved the field beyond Freud's emphasis on those early childhood years.
Okay, makes sense. So, next up we have cognitive theories. These focus on how our thinking develops over time. Piaget, Vygotsky, and the information processing approach are big names here.
Right. Piaget is kind of a rock star in developmental psychology. His cognitive developmental theory suggested that children go through these four distinct stages of understanding the world: sensorimotor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. And his theory argues that kids are actively building their understanding through processes of organization and adaptation.
And I know Vygotsky had a slightly different perspective. He really emphasized culture, didn't he?
He did. Vygotsky's sociocultural cognitive theory is all about how learning to use the tools and skills that are valued in our society, often through interacting with more knowledgeable people, drives our cognitive development. It's about how we learn from others.
Makes sense. And then we've got the information processing theory.
Right. This theory, it kind of views the human mind like a computer. It focuses on how we take in information, how we process it, store it, retrieve it, and use it. And instead of stages, it sees development as this continuous improvement in our processing abilities.
Okay, so that's a more gradual, incremental approach to how our thinking changes. Moving on, we've got the behavioral and social cognitive theories. Here, Skinner and Bandura are the major players.
Yep. Skinner's operant conditioning, it focuses on how our behavior is shaped by consequences. Rewards make us more likely to repeat a behavior, while punishments make us less likely. He was all about observable behavior and how it changes in response to those external factors.
Okay, so rewards and punishments, classic behavioral psychology.
Exactly. And Bandura, he kind of expanded on that idea by recognizing that we learn by watching others too.
Ah, yes, the power of modeling.
Right. His social cognitive theory highlights observational learning as a super important way that we acquire new behaviors. His theory emphasizes how our thoughts, feelings, and our environment all interact to shape our behavior. He was big on this idea of forethought.
Forethought, what does that mean?
It's about our ability to think ahead and anticipate the consequences of our actions.
Okay, so it's not just about responding to the immediate situation.
Exactly. We can plan and make choices based on what we think might happen. Now, let's talk about ethological theory. This one views development from a more biological and evolutionary perspective. Lorenz and Bowlby are the key thinkers here.
Okay, so this one's all about how our biology influences our development.
Yep. Ethology argues that our behavior is influenced by our genes, by our evolution as a species. And it stresses that there are certain time periods when particular types of learning are most effective. Think of Lorenz and his work on imprinting in geese.
Imprinting.
It's this innate, instinctual form of learning that happens very rapidly during a critical period early in life.
Like those baby geese who follow the first moving object they see after hatching.
Exactly. And Bowlby, he applied these ethological ideas to human attachment, arguing that the bond we form with our caregivers early on has major long-term effects on our social and emotional development.
So how we connect with our parents early on can influence our relationships throughout our lives.
That's the idea. He talked about sensitive periods for forming these attachments, suggesting that there are optimal times for those bonds to develop.
Okay, that makes sense. And finally, we have ecological theory. This one's all about how different environmental systems influence our development, with Bronfenbrenner being the main name everyone thinks of.
Yep. Bronfenbrenner's bioecological theory is super influential. It describes development as happening within 5 interconnected levels of the environment. The microsystem, which is your immediate surroundings like your family and your school. The mesosystem, which is the connections between those microsystems. The exosystem, which includes external influences you don't directly participate in, like your parents' workplaces. The macrosystem, which is that broader cultural context. And then the chronosystem.
Wow, that's a lot of systems. What's the chronosystem?
It's about how historical events and changes over time influence our development.
So like growing up during a major war or a pandemic would be part of your chronosystem.
Exactly. And Bronfenbrenner, he actually added bio to his theory later on because he recognized the importance of our biological characteristics in shaping development too.
Makes sense. So it's like those Russian nesting dolls with all these different layers of influence. Okay, so with all these different theories out there, how do researchers choose which one to use, or do they just pick one and stick with it?
Well, it's not uncommon for researchers to take what's called an eclectic theoretical orientation. This means they don't limit themselves to just one theory. Instead, they might pull the best ideas and principles from each theory to try to explain what they're studying. It's about using the right tool for the job.
So it's more like having a toolbox full of different tools, using the strengths of each perspective to build a complete picture.
That's a great way to put it. Now, once they have their theoretical framework, how do researchers actually gather the information they need to test their hypotheses?
Yeah, how do they collect all that data?
Well, our sources highlight several main methods. Observation is a really fundamental one. Researchers observe and record behavior. This can be done in a controlled laboratory setting, or they can do naturalistic observation.
So like scientists in the wild.
Pretty much. It's about observing people in their everyday environments without trying to manipulate or change anything.
Like that example of researchers observing how parents interact with their kids at a science museum. That's naturalistic observation, right?
Exactly. Then we have surveys and interviews. Those are great for getting people's self-reported thoughts, feelings, beliefs, and experiences.
Just ask people directly.
Right. But it's important to remember that there's something called social desirability bias. People don't always answer honestly. They might answer in a way that makes them look good.
Totally. We've all done that at some point. What about case studies?
Case studies, they're really in-depth looks at a single individual. They can be super rich in detail, but the downside is that it's hard to generalize from one person to a whole population.
Okay, so case studies, they're kind of like those deep dives into one person's life. And increasingly, researchers are turning to physiological measures to study development.
You're right. This includes measuring things like hormone levels, for example, measuring cortisol levels in saliva to see how stressed someone is. And then there's the use of neuroimaging, like fMRI and EEG. Those techniques allow researchers to study brain activity.
And I know some studies even track things like heart rate, right?
Exactly. It's all about understanding the biological underpinnings of development.
So like that study we read about that used fMRI to see how teenagers' brains respond differently to certain tasks depending on whether they drink alcohol or not.
That's a great example. Those physiological measures are giving us incredible insights. Now, let's talk about how researchers actually design their studies.
Yeah, what are the different research designs they use?
There are three main types. First, you have descriptive research, which aims to just describe what's happening, to paint a picture. Then there's correlational research. This one examines the relationships between two or more variables.
Okay, so like, are two things connected or not?
Right. Correlational research can tell us if things tend to go together, but super important. Correlation does not equal causation. Just because two things are related doesn't mean one causes the other.
Right. Like maybe there's a third variable that's actually driving both of them, or maybe the cause and effect is flipped.
Exactly. Correlation can point us in the right direction, but it doesn't tell the whole story. And finally, we have experimental research. This one is considered the gold standard.
The gold standard.
Yeah. It's the most powerful design for figuring out cause and effect. In experimental research, you're actually manipulating one or more variables, called the independent variables, to see their effect on another variable, called the dependent variable, while trying to control everything else.
Okay, so you're isolating the effect of one thing on another thing.
Exactly. And to do this, you often have two groups of participants. An experimental group that receives the special treatment or manipulation, and a control group that doesn't.
Like in that study about exercise during pregnancy, the exercise was the independent variable and the baby's sleep patterns were the dependent variable, right?
Exactly. And it's crucial to use random assignment, which means assigning people to those groups randomly to make sure the groups are as similar as possible.
Right. That way you know that any differences you see between the groups are actually due to the thing you're manipulating and not some other random factor. Okay, so now researchers have their theories, they've got their research questions, and they've chosen a design. What else do they have to consider?
Well, they also have to think about the time span of research. How long will the study last?
Makes sense.
One approach is called the cross-sectional approach. This one compares different age groups at a single point in time.
Okay, so like taking a snapshot.
Exactly. It's really efficient, but the problem is it doesn't show us how individuals change over time, and it can be affected by these things called cohort effects.
Cohort effects.
Yep. A cohort is a group of people born around the same time, so they share similar historical experiences. Those shared experiences can create differences between age groups that aren't actually about age itself.
So like people who grew up before the internet versus people who grew up with it from the beginning, that's a cohort effect.
Exactly. Educational opportunities have also changed a lot over the generations, which is another example. And this is why sometimes cross-sectional studies can show a different picture of cognitive decline in older adults compared to longitudinal studies.
What's a longitudinal study?
That's when researchers study the same group of individuals over a period of time. It's a way to actually track those changes.
Okay, so cross-sectional is like a snapshot, and longitudinal is like a movie.
That's a good way to think about it.
And those generational labels like baby boomers or millennials or Gen Z, those are basically cohorts too, right?
Right. They're shaped by those shared experiences that can influence everything from their values to how they use technology. Okay, I think it's time to wrap things up. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We sure have. Let's recap some of those key takeaways for our listeners.
So we started by exploring the lifespan perspective, and what's the main message there? Development is a lifelong process, and it's multifaceted. It's shaped by this really complex interaction between biological, cognitive, and socio-emotional factors.
And we can't forget about those different stages of life and all the different ways of thinking about age, right?
Exactly, and we talked about those big debates in the field.
Yeah.
Nature